Psalms 78.
My people, listen to my law. Listen carefully to the words from my mouth. I will speak in a parable. I will speak puzzles from long ago. We heard these things. We know these things. Our fathers told us these things. We will not hide these things from our fathers' sons. Those sons will tell the next generation about Jehovah's praises and Jehovah's strength and Jehovah's amazing works. Jehovah established a teaching in Jacob, and Jehovah gave a law to Israel. Jehovah commanded our fathers to teach his law to their sons, so that the later generation will know. Sons will be born, and those sons will stand and tell their own sons. They will be confident in God, and they will not forget God's works, and they will guard his commands, and they will not be the same as their fathers. Their fathers were stubborn and rebellious. Their fathers were a generation without a firm heart, and their spirit was not faithful to God. Sons of Ephraim had weapons and shot a bow, but they turned back from battle. They did not keep God's covenant, and they refused to walk in God's law, and they forgot God's actions. God made them see his amazing works, but those people forgot God's works. God did an amazing work in front of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the land of Zoan. God cut open the sea, and God took his people across the sea, and God made the water stand like a heap. And in the daytime, God led his people with a cloud, and all night God led his people with a light from fire. God cuts open rocks in the desert, and God gives drink like water from a deep ocean. And God makes streams of water flow from a cliff, and God makes water flow down like rivers. But the people sinned against God again. The people rebel against the high God in the dry place. And the people tested God in their heart. They asked for food for themselves, and they spoke against God. They said, "Can God prepare a table in the desert? Look, God hit a rock, and water flows, and rivers overflowed. But can God also give bread? And can God prepare meat for his people?" When Jehovah heard, he was furious, and a fire burned in Jacob, and God was very angry in Israel. Why? Because the people did not believe in God, and the people did not trust God to save them. God commanded clouds above, and God opened doors in the heavens, and God rained manna over the people so that they could eat it. And God gave the people grain from the heavens. Man ate the bread of strong angels. God sent plenty of food to make them full. In the heavens, God brings a wind from the east, and with his strength, God leads a wind from the south, and God rains meat over them as dust, and God sends flying birds. There were as many birds as sand on the seashore, and God God makes the birds fall inside his camp, around his tents, and the people eat, and the people are very full, and God gives the people what they want. The people still wanted to eat. Their food was still in their mouth when God became very angry with them, and God killed some of their fat people, and God struck down some young men in Israel. After all this happened, the people continued sinning, and the people did not believe God's amazing works, and God finished their days in emptiness, and God finished their years in disaster. When God killed the people, then people sought God, and people turned and sought God eagerly. Then people remembered that God was their rock, and the high God was their Saviour, and people flattered God with their mouth, and people lied to God with their tongue. But their heart was not faithful to God, and the people were not faithful to God's covenant. But God is merciful. God covers sin, and God does not destroy people. And many times God held back his anger, and God restrained his fury, and God remembers that the people are only flesh. Their spirit goes away, doesn't return again. When those people were in the desert, they rebelled very much against God. They made God sad in the dry, empty land. Again and again they tested the holy God of Israel, and they made God sad. They did not remember God's hand. They did not remember the day God saved them from their oppressor. God sent his signs in Egypt and his wonderful works in the land of Zoan, and God changes their rivers to become blood, and the Egyptian people do not drink their streams. God sends a swarm of flying insects to the Egyptian people, and they bite them. And God sends frogs, and the frogs destroy Egypt. And God gives their crops to destructive insects. And God gives their hard farm work to many grasshoppers. God kills their vines with hail, and God kills their fig trees with severe weather. And God sent hailstones on their animals, and flashes of lightning on their farm animals. God showed his anger to the Egyptian people, fury and rage and disaster. God sent angels to destroy. God prepares a path for his anger. God did not save their lives from death, and God gave their lives to disease. God killed all the firstborn sons in Egypt. God killed the oldest sons, the beginning of the Egyptian father's strength. God killed these sons in the tents of Ham. And God led his people out from Egypt as a shepherd leads a flock. And God led them as a herd of animals in the wilderness. And God led his people so that they trusted and they were not afraid. But the sea covered their enemies, and God led his people to the border of his holy land. God led his people to this mountain. God took this mountain with his right hand. In front of his people, God forced other nations to leave the land, and God gave an inheritance to his people, and God made the tribes of Israel to live in the other nations' homes. But the people of Israel tested God. The people rebelled against the high God. The people did not keep God's teachings. And the people turned away from God. The people were unfaithful to God as their fathers were unfaithful. The people were similar to a bow that doesn't shoot arrows straight. And the people provoke God with their high places of worship, and the people make God jealous with their carved idols. God heard this, and God was furious, and God greatly rejected Israel. Earlier, God lived among the people in a tent at Shiloh, but now God left that tent and went away, and God let enemies capture his strength, and God gave oppressors power over his glory. And God gave his people to the sword, and God was furious with his inheritance. Fire killed God's young men, and no one praised God's virgins. People killed God's priests with a sword, and the widows of God's people do not weep for the dead. Then the Lord woke as a man waking from sleep, and as a strong man shouting from wine. And God hit his oppressors on the back. God made his enemies ashamed forever. And God rejected the tent of Joseph. And God did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but God chose the tribe of Judah. God chose Zion, the mountain he loved. And God built his holy place as the high heavens. God established his holy place as the land for a very long time. And God chose David, his servant. And God took David from fields of sheep. David cared for sheep with lambs. But God took David to become the shepherd of God's people in Jacob. God took David to become the shepherd of God's inheritance in Israel. And David pastures the people of God with a perfect heart. And David leads the people of God